Hi, it's good to have your company. You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. My name's Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Now, between 1940 and 1944, a remote plateau in central eastern France became the centre of one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of World War II. Le Chambon and surrounding villages and farms during those years had literally thousands of refugees come through. The majority were Jewish children seeking refuge from deportation to death camps in Europe. They were hidden, protected and cared for. The Protestant pastor André Trocme was a key figure in this story, and it's a story of enormous courage and kindness extended to people in great need. And that story has been told in a new book called A Good Place to Hide. Peter Grose is the author. He's in the studio to talk about it. Great to have you in, Peter.
Thank you, Simon. It's great to be here.
Now, you say in the book that in the dark days of World War II, human decency was in short supply, but on the plateau it triumphed. How was it that this plateau in central eastern France came to be such a place of sanctuary for especially Jewish refugees?
Well, in a sense, it's a mystery to this day. I mean, the people there, if you ask them, why did you do it? They say, well, we just did what anybody else would have done. Well, they didn't. They did what nobody else would have done. What everybody else did was to turn their back and look the other way and say, it's not my problem. But they absolutely accepted this. They say, well, these people needed help, so what else were you meant to do? This was a Huguenot village, and the Huguenots had 250 years of fairly serious religious persecution in France.
This is the Protestant group.
Yes. I mean, a Huguenot is technically a follower of John Calvin, and so that particular Calvinist thread of Protestantism had a pretty rough ride. The tradition of persecution and therefore standing up to the persecutors was part of that Huguenot culture and part of that Huguenot life. That was factor one. Factor two, they had a tradition of hospitality. The farmers there would take kids in the summer and give them a summer holiday. There were hostels and guest houses all over the place because it was up in the mountains, the mountain air, rather like the Blue Mountains in a reputation in Sydney in Australia. This was a place where you could breathe clean air and lead a healthy life. So basically they were used to taking in strangers. And the third thing, of course, was the remoteness of the plateau. It was so far away. It was not strategic. There were no resources there. There was no coal. There was not much by way of timber. So there was no need to invade it. I mean, if you captured the plateau and held it in an iron grip, you'd have nothing to show for it at the end of the day. And so they left them alone.
Now, you make the point in the book that it wasn't only Le Chambon, but plenty of villages in the area. And it wasn't only André Trocme, but both him and that village were crucial in this story, weren't they?
Absolutely, and you've made the point exactly right. There were 12 Protestant pastors in the immediate area, all of whom helped. I mean, without exception, they helped. But it was also the case that Le Chambon was the key to it. The Yad Vashem Institute in Jerusalem has an award of Righteous Among the Nations for people who, the qualification for this award is that you must have saved the life of more than one Jew, you must have done it at risk to your own life or to the risk to the life of your family, and you must have done it for no reward. Now, there was something like 80 people were given this Righteous Among the Nations award in Le Chambon, and I mean, like more than anywhere else. And the whole village and its surrounding communes was awarded Righteous Among the Nations. It's the only French village where this happened, and one of only two in the world. The other one is in Holland.
You said that the plateau was in quite a remote area. What kind of risks are we actually talking about? What kind of risks were they taking by harbouring Jewish refugees?
Well, the level of risk changed. In the period in which Le Chambon and the plateau was in the so-called free zone, then the risk was from the gendarmes. And frankly, the French gendarmes' heart wasn't in it. They didn't try very hard. But in late 1942, early 1943, when the Germans swept south, suddenly you had the Gestapo, and believe me, they were serious. And so you had, particularly when they were looking not so much for Jewish refugees, but they were looking for resistance fighters. And the Germans believed that the farmers were hiding resistance fighters, and they were right. I mean, there was no two ways about that. But there was one terrible weekend when they raided farms, and the day after the raid, there were 11 farmers just shot, unarmed farmers shot dead.
And did that dramatic increase in risk, did that change people's willingness to be involved?
Well, they still did it. I think that they were a lot more wary once the Germans had arrived. And in particular, there was a group of German soldiers who were not armed and not particularly aggressive, or not aggressive at all. They were essentially soldiers convalescing from wounds in the Eastern Front, in the Russian front. And they were pretty grateful to put as much distance between the Eastern Front and themselves as they humanly could. So they were going to sort of keep their heads down and not cause trouble. But they were holed up in a hotel in the middle of the town. And right next door to the hotel was a guest house, Tante Solly, which had 15 to 20 Jewish kids in it. And if they'd been really, really, really alert, they could have picked up the fact that the resistance headquarters was over the street from them.
They not only sheltered them, there was a whole system of forgery, so false papers, and then taking people to Switzerland. Some of those parts of the book are really kind of rollicking stories, aren't they? They're gripping stories.
Well, the forger is amazing, Oskar Rozovsky. He was an 18-year-old Latvian Jew, and he wanted to be a doctor, but there were laws in Vichy France which prevented Jews from, kept them out of the professions. So Oskar got a job as a typewriter repairman, and he repaired mimeograph machines. And his particular beat was the local prefecture. Well, the prefecture hands out all the papers in France. It hands out the carte d'identité, it hands out driving licenses and residence permits and everything else. So Oskar knew the machines that created these documents literally inside out. He knew them from the inside. And so he went to Le Chambon and he set up a forgery bureau. 18 years old. In the space of 2 years, he forged 5,000 sets of false papers, about 3,500 for Jews and about 1,500 for young Frenchmen, dodging the forced labour laws, and also for members of the resistance on the run. And he didn't just knock out carte d'identité. He would produce all these supporting documents so that if the police grabbed you and said, OK, where's your papers, and pulled your wallet out, then inside it would be parking fines, library cards, Boy Scout memberships, or trade union memberships, anything Oskar could think of, so that the policeman would get a whole raft of documents, not just one. And I mean, how could this bloke have all these wonderful things and not be what he said? So thus did Oskar, never failed, basically. Nobody was ever nicked that used Oskar's false papers.
You're listening to Life and Faith. We're talking with Peter Grose, the author of A Good Place to Hide, How One French Community Saved Thousands of Lives in World War II. I wonder, if Peter, if you could mention and talk about the faith of these leading pastors, the thing that drove them in this direction of really risky kind of self-sacrifice.
Yes, and it was a remarkable effort. I mean, no two ways about it. And André Trocme was a charismatic figure. No two ways. I mean, he was a leader. He was tall. He was well-spoken. He was forceful and with a transparently powerful intellect. And he was quite simply the leader of that community. People wouldn't move. If some problem came up, the first question asked was, does Trocme know about this? What does he think? That's almost the definition of a leadership. And so Trocme was incredibly important, but so was Daniel Cote, for instance, in Foy down the road, who was a young pastor who ran smuggling missions. Edouard Thies, who was a pastor, Trocme's assistant, and also headmaster of the secondary school. Thies was a forger, and he was also a people smuggler. He got people across to Switzerland. So these were not guys with a theory, preaching to you. They were right, they had their sleeves rolled up and their hands in the washing up water. They were really doing it.
You were actually fortunate enough to be able to interview a lot of the people who were involved, who are still alive. What was your impression of them, the people of the plateau, after all these years?
Well, I mean, the reputation of Protestants, as we were saying, of Huguenots, was being rather sort of dour and honest and perhaps even a tad dull. Well, I wouldn't call them a tad dull. That's very unfair. But certainly they're not flamboyant. I mean, if you go into the village of Le Chambon, it's very different from, say, the skiing chalets across the Rhone, which are only sort of a few kilometres away, really. But there's no bright colours, there's no flowers in window boxes. The village is the original 50 Shades of Grey.
What did you make of the non-violent resistance? Because that was a big part of this. You're not a pacifist yourself. What did you sort of, having assessed the story, what was your sense of it?
Well, I think it was very important. It was a major factor. Trocme was a convinced pacifist absolutely from the word go. He'd been a pacifist in effect from his teenage years. His family came from a town called Saint-Quentin up in the north of France, and the River Somme runs through the town. So during World War I, he was right in the thick of the fighting, and he could see bodies being taken through the town, and he could smell gangrenous flesh and all sorts of stuff like that, and he was repelled by it. And he was an absolutely convinced pacifist, and the pacifism drove him, without doubt, in Le Chambon. That was one of the key factors, his pacifism. Now, there came a time when his pacifism was increasingly sidelined, and really that was from 1943 onwards, when the Germans began to retreat. I mean, the Russians started winning. The Allies invaded Algeria and were hovering over Europe. And suddenly the Germans, who looked like all conquering up until that point, suddenly looked vulnerable. And at that point, then pacifism became less attractive, and the point of a gun became a bit more interesting. And there was no doubt that there was a turnaround. But I would say Trocme's pacifism certainly protected a vast number of those refugees, those Jewish and other refugees. If the prevailing spirit on the plateau had not been of pacifism, but rather of an armed resistance, then I don't think the rescue mission would have succeeded in the way that it did.
You say there might have been 3,500 people saved because of the actions of these people in the villages.
Yes, I mean, it's the best estimate you can do. I mean, really, you're just basing it on Oscar Rozovsky's number of 5,000. Nobody knows. Nobody kept records. I mean, one has to. There were things that were well organised, the smuggling of money into the plateau, because all these hostels and so on, I mean, they weren't free. The people in there had to be fed, they had to be warmed, they had to be staffed, and there were all sorts of costs involved, so money had to arrive. And it came basically through the Quakers from America. It went into Switzerland, and it was smuggled literally in suitcases out of Switzerland to keep the whole thing running. But I go back to saying there was no organisation. There wasn't a committee, and there wasn't a president, and there wasn't a secretary, and there wasn't a vice president and a deputy, and 8 other members of the committee. It was done spontaneously without any organisation at all.
Peter, there are some amazing characters in your book. You must have enjoyed coming across some of these. Virginia Hall is one that stands out with the wooden leg. Do you want to just tell that briefly?
Well, basically she was an SOE agent, and as Simon says, she had a wooden leg which she called Cuthbert. She was a game lass, as all one can say. And at one point, when the Germans had swept south and occupied the whole of France, she went through one of the airmen's escape routes from Lyon to the Spanish border. And this involved crossing on foot the Pyrenees in November. She climbed 3,000 metres in deep snow with her wooden leg. And that's one tough lady. But there's a marvellous story. She was about halfway up the Pyrenees. She felt she had to report back to SOE in London. And so she sent them a cable saying, I'm fine, but Cuthbert is being tiresome. And the guy at the far end didn't know about Cuthbert and sent a suitably ruthless message back saying, if Cuthbert tiresome, eliminate him.
Thankfully, it didn't come to that. There's a very nice ending to your book where you kind of put this story into a contemporary context. I wonder if you could talk about the links that you would make between the story of rescue of refugees on the plateau in World War II in France and the plight of refugees around the world today.
I think anybody reading my book would approve of the actions of the people of Le Chambon, the villagers, and the people of the plateau. So how come we can react to this particular story saying, gosh, what wonderful, decent, good folk, and then a week later vote for whichever politician promises to be nastiest to refugees and asylum seekers? I can't see how you can hold these two views simultaneously.
Well, Peter, it's a fabulous book. Congratulations on it. The book is called A Good Place to Hide, How One French Community Saved Thousands of Lives in World War II. So good to get you in to talk about it, Peter. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.